the cloud. Okay. So welcome, everybody. We are very happy to have this presentation tonight by Professor Fernando Reimers on educating global citizens. And just a little bit of introduction, and then I will turn it over to Professor Reimers. Professor Fernando Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. He's an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Education of the, I'm sorry, I'm muting people, of the International Academy of Education and of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's an expert in the field of global education, and his research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so that they can thrive in the 21st century. He's been a member of UNESCO's Commission on the Future of Education, which wrote the report Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. He has developed curriculum aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and during the pandemic, you all remember that, led numerous studies examining the educational consequences of the pandemic and identifying options to sustain educational opportunity and improve on it. So at Hugsy, the Graduate School of Education, Professor Reimers co-directs the new International Education and Policy Management Pathway, which is a master's degree program that launched this fall. He also directs the Global Education Innovation Initiative, a cross-country research and practice collaborative focusing on education in the 21st century. He's written or edited 56 books and over 100 articles and chapters. He's also authored several children's books focused on inclusive values, and I'll put some of those book links in the chat as we go. He has served on the Harvard Graduate School of Education faculty since 1998, and previous to that, he worked at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, the Harvard Institute for International Development, and the World Bank. On behalf of the Harvard Club of New Hampshire, we are delighted to welcome Professor Fernando Reimers to present to us Educating Global Citizens. And just a note of logistics, we're going to let Professor Reimers go through his presentation. If you have questions, please post them in the chat, and we will get to those at the end. And you can also have an opportunity then to raise your hand and ask the question. So at this point, Professor Reimers, if you want to share your screen, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Cynthia, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Harvard Club of New Hampshire for this kind invitation to share some ideas with you tonight and maybe engage in a bit of conversation around this topic of educating students to recognize themselves as members of communities larger than the immediate jurisdictions where they live, or even larger than the countries of which they carry a passport. So I'm going to present some ideas on that topic. So let me first define global citizenship. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean by that not someone who reneges on their obligations to nation or locality or tribe or family, but someone who, in addition to that, sees themselves as part of a worldwide community and understands that what they do has an impact beyond their own borders. For example, through climate, in terms of human rights, through trade, and so on. Someone who cares about issues that are global in nature, poverty, inequality, the environment, peace and justice, and has some sense of responsibility to those issues. Someone who respects different cultures and perspectives and has a curiosity to learn from them, and someone who takes action in whatever way to make the world more fair and sustainable. Obviously, global citizenship is different than citizenship in a nation. There is no global passport. It's more of a mindset and a way of imagining oneself in the world. Now, this idea is not new. And this phrase, homo sum, humani nihil alienum puto, expressed by Terence, Publius Terentius after, about 200 years before our era. So about 22, 23 centuries ago, basically states, I'm human and I think nothing human is alien to me. So this idea is at least 22, 23 centuries old, and it's an idea that a number of the Stoics expressed in their writings that took shape Montaigne, the writer of the Renaissance, loved that idea so much that he had it inscribed on a beam in his library. Of course, Kant also developed that notion of kind of universal obligations to other members of the human race. But I think it's a lot more recently, probably a fact of the last century, where that idea took shape and translated into a number of educational initiatives. There are some who argue that it was when we began to see images of Earth from space, and I think that began in 1946, and the first image taken by a human was even more recent than that, that we began to develop these awareness of kind of a common, of a shared humanity with other people. But what are some other expressions of this global mindset? Well, a curiosity about what are the risks that we share with other fellow travelers on this spaceship Earth. The World Economic Forum produces once a year a report on what are the main global risks based on essentially surveying about 800 people who know about a range of actions. And of course, the existence of the World Economic Forum as a convening that brings together people from all kinds of different industries and sectors is an expression of this notion that we do have shared planetary interests and opportunities to collaborate. Notion of global. This is a report of the National Intelligence Council. We used to do these until 2021. Every 4 years, the council kind of examined global trends. So global citizenship is being curious about these global trends that are going to impact us, and in this case, our security. And so, of course, an exemplar of one of these topics that invokes global curiosity is a topic of change in our climate, changes in our climate. So all of these trends translate into educators asking, so how do we prepare students to understand their membership in the shared world and how do we make them curious about these various global trends and risks and opportunities? So two global organizations which are themselves an expression of this cosmopolitanism that kicks in after World War II, UNESCO. So as all of you probably know, the UN is a byproduct of the end of World War II, where looking back, a number of governments asked themselves, how do we prevent this kind of horror from happening again? And they constitute an organization with the explicit purpose of contributing to peace and to global stability. And the UN then drafts sort of a charter, a compact, in the form of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Takes the group that shapes the UN convenes in San Francisco in 1945, and the declaration is adopted in December of 1948. So it takes a little over 2 years to produce that. And that declaration includes 30 rights, 30 rights that humans have because they're human, and that are going to be the mobilizing force, the animating set of goals for the UN. And one of those is the right to education. And then to achieve that right, the UN establishes an organization, UNESCO, the UN Education, Science, and Culture Organization, with the explicit purpose of advancing the right of education. So UNESCO, in its history of 8 decades, has thrice put together a commission looking at global trends and asking what are their implications for education. And the last time it did that was just prior to the pandemic in 2019, basically convened this commission chaired by the then president of Ethiopia. And that commission produced this report, a set of ideas about how do we prepare students for a better future. And the first 2 chapters of that book talk about these shared global challenges: climate change, democratic declining, polarization in societies, artificial intelligence, and the disruptions that it'll create, and then says, okay, what are the implications for what students should know and be able to do? And the other organization, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, also one of these Organizations of Global Governance, the product of the post-war, post-World War II order, also has an education division that produces every so often a set of frameworks about what we should teach. And the last framework produced is called the Learning Compass 2030, that basically outlines what are the kinds of capacities that we should be developing. And if you read those capacities, a lot of them have to do with understanding a world in which we are increasingly interdependent and being able to act to contribute to that world, to shape a better future, not only in the local spheres where students live, but also addressing global topics such as climate change, for example. So the UN every 15 years convenes governments, but other actors as well, to develop a set of goals that are going to animate development efforts over the ensuing 15 years. And the last time this was done was in September of 2015, and they adopted what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, a really aspirational vision of a world in which we have no poverty, no hunger, in which we have health and well-being for all, a range of 17 goals, one of which is education for all. And if you look at the target for the education for all, it's very much about educating students to develop this kind of global mindset, this global consciousness. You see that here. So let's come back then to education. How do we make these things happen for students in schools? And I'm going to be referring to K through 12 schools, which is where I have done most of this work. In the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about some of the things I do at Harvard with my graduate students, but that's not going to be the focus of my presentation. So how do we take those ideas? Obviously, we cannot take the SDGs as such. I mean, we could teach them to students and teach them what they are and maybe their context and so on. But most goals of that sort need to be translated into some kind of learning standards, learning outcomes that we hope students will gain. And then those should guide a curriculum, some kind of scope and sequence that says, well, how are we going to get students there? And the challenge with curriculum, all curriculum is really based on two hypotheses, right? The hypothesis that if we engage our students in a certain set of activities, they're going to learn certain things. So if I teach A, my students will learn B. And if they learn those things, the consequences to them or their communities will be X, Y, and Z. Problem is, of course, that like any hypothesis, those may be right or they may be wrong. And so a few years ago, I reviewed a lot of the evaluative research on curricula which had been developed to teach students about climate change. And most of those curricula are of the sort of basically teaching students the science of climate change. To simplify, the hypothesis on which they are built would be something like this. If we teach students about climate change, they will learn that it's a serious challenge, largely influenced by human behavior. And if they learn those facts, they will undertake actions that will mitigate climate change. But when you look at the evidence of about 200 studies that have looked at the impact of curricula of that sort, you find that they are at best ineffective, at worst harmful, because the students can learn those facts all right, but that doesn't lead them to see themselves in the picture in any way. So evaluations that measure not only knowledge of students, but measure their own perception of their own ability to impact any of these factors show that, in fact, that belief diminishes the more knowledge they gain. You might say, well, that's normal. The more you understand this problem, the more skeptical you are that you can do something about it. But there is a researcher in Norway, Maria Ojala, who conducted some very interesting experiments where she assigned randomly students at the age of about 15 to two kinds of treatments. One treatment learned essentially a course on science of climate. And the other course learned the same, the other group had access to the same course, but they were also invited to participate in a project of some sort where they took a goal which they thought would have some connection to climate and basically collaborated in achieving that goal. And while there were no differences between these groups in terms of the knowledge that they gained, there were very significant differences in terms of the belief that students had that they could do something about this problem, with the second group being the one who actually developed that sense of self-efficacy. And so then to go back to all of the SDGs, the challenge is how do we create testable hypotheses about what is it that we need to teach students so that if they gain certain competencies, we'll move in the direction articulating that. And that's what I've tried to do with these three different curriculum resources, which I have developed over the last decade. The first one I developed initially for an elite independent school that was going to be part of a network of 20 schools, the Avenue Schools in Manhattan. And when they were designing the school, they invited me to develop a world course for them. And I agreed to do that on the condition that they would not own the course, but I would own the course for the purpose of just making it available to anyone who wanted to use it, which I have done. And the intention of that course was to be provocative, is to illustrate that we could actually take students in a rigorous course that went all the way from kindergarten to high school, that engaged them a certain number of hours every week with various aspects of global education. And I'm going to share in a second how we did it. I also learned that that course was required very special teachers, very well-trained teachers. Now, of course, when we're designing these, we knew that the Avenue Schools was going to recruit teachers from some of the best independent schools in the country, as they did. But as I began to share that course with superintendents in public school districts, many of them said, we would need to invest a lot in professional development of teachers so they can teach this course. So we developed a simpler version of that, which is the second book that you see here, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons. I'll be saying a word about that. And then the third set of materials are basically 7 different approaches, just to underscore that there isn't a singular way to teach these things, that this is just an approach that begins with the SDGs, translate those into learning outcomes, and then builds a scope and sequence that starts that goes through the process of what's called backward mapping a curriculum. So just to say a few words about the World Course, what were the basic organizing principles? Well, we began developing the outcomes, and the outcomes were about 180 learning outcomes that guided this curriculum. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Then a lot of the scope and sequence was designed so that these would be a project-based curriculum, that students would be collaborating with others in projects that were very often extended projects over a long period of time. So the emphasis was in providing students the opportunity to learn from their own doing, and we're trying to develop not only knowledge but skills and dispositions. Every year was organized around a coherent theme that concluded with some kind of capstone. The units were interdisciplinary. There were many things in that curriculum that are not commonly taught in high school. For example, there was a public health set of units that began with pandemics. And the reason we thought of including pandemics is because in designing this course, we looked at the World Economic Forum global risks, and it'd been known for a while that a pandemic was a looming risk for humanity. This is before COVID, and we said you need to know what a pandemic is and how it functions and how can you mitigate its impact and so on. So that's an example. There were units on various conflicts around the world, conflict in the Middle East and others. We said to understand contemporary world, you need to have some knowledge of those conflicts. The goal of this curriculum was to cultivate agency of the students, their own ability and especially their desire to make a difference, not to cause them to see themselves as spectators of this world, but as actors who could actually make a difference with others. The idea was to teach them to learn from what works as well as from challenges, help them develop kind of an innovative and entrepreneurial mindset, a lot of effort to see the parents and the community as resources in the school, develop what we now would call 21st century skills. At that time, that language was not as much in use as it is today. The focus were the SDGs and human rights, a lot of connections between global and local. We engaged students with issues that were complex, that didn't have simple answers. For many of these units, the notion was that a complex problem requires the capacity to think in terms of different scenarios. Climate would be an example, and to think probabilistically, to think about different scenarios and their probabilities. And that's a skill that can be cultivated. You can create activities and projects that cause students to build different scenarios, to assign probabilities to them, and so on. The curriculum was age appropriate, but it was not infantilizing. It started from the premise that students are smart. And it took students from the personal and the immediate to more advanced and conceptual understanding. So I mentioned that we had about 180 different constructs that guided that, and we placed them in three buckets. One was intercultural competency, and we thought there were three dimensions of that: relating to other people, relating to oneself, ethical frameworks, knowledge and skills in the following buckets: economic, trade and demography, culture, politics, science, technology, innovation, public health, demography, entrepreneurship, and then some work and mind habits. Just to give you an idea, each of those was translated into a fairly operational definition, right? So one of them would be the student is able to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives. They understand who they are as well as the identities of others and how culture shapes identity, can work productively in and lead effectively intercultural teams. Anyway, we translated these into the kinds of definitions that could be assessed and that would make it possible for several people to understand what is it that we're talking about when we said intercultural competency. As I mentioned, that curriculum has inspired many efforts, for the most part in independent schools with a lot of resources. And not necessarily that those schools would take the curriculum. The only place, to my knowledge, that taught the curriculum as intended was the Avenue School. But they basically use that to develop their own variations. And the reason is that this curriculum started with the notion that this global course was going to be a hub, and this hub in the curriculum would take 8 to 10 hours a week from kindergarten to high school, and every other subject would be connected to this integrated hub. And that kind of design is probably more than most schools are willing to do. So what many schools have done is basically use that as an inspirational and then embedded in the existing subjects that they have in the curriculum, many of the ideas that are here. Anyway, one of the local districts here, Waltham, the superintendent got Thomas. She was in the same group that you were in, you may remember, and I think it was after I made a presentation to that group. Thomas Jefferson, here with us today, was then a superintendent and was part of a group that got together from time to time to talk about these kinds of issues. And she was very inspired, and she basically invited me to speak at a convening of all teachers in the district, and she got copies of the book. And then within 2 weeks, she called me and she said, I would need to invest, for example, in teaching my teachers about pandemics before they can teach their students about pandemics. We need something simpler. So we went back to the drawing board, and we then developed this book. And what this book is, it took the same ideas that I have presented, but instead of translating those ideas into 350 units, which is what the World Course has, it basically said only 5 lessons per grade. And the 5 lessons per grade are very simple, but they're meant to be just a prototype, an illustration of the kind of thing that is necessary. And then we use those lessons as a way to teach students to write their own lessons aligned with the SDGs. So basically, this book contains a protocol that explains how do you go from the SDGs to developing learning outcomes, and then from that to developing lessons per grade. Then a strategy to create a process of teacher professional development in the school at the same time that teachers are designing that curriculum, and then an example, the 60 lessons. And so this is basically a change management process, something that I had completely omitted in the first book. I kind of assumed that a curriculum can teach itself because this whole school was being built at the same time as the curriculum, and teachers were going to be hired with that curriculum in mind. But I didn't realize that in most places exist, and they have a culture, and they have priorities, and they have other goals, and so on. And so basically this change management process said, well, this is what you need to do. I basically put in writing the responses we're giving to the teachers who began to try the World Course and who told us what were some of the bottlenecks they were encountering. You have to put a team in charge. They have to spend some time developing a long-term vision, study these global trends, study the SDGs. They then have to articulate a framework of learning standards, and then they can use that to audit what they have and to say, okay, what do we have that we want to keep? What do we need to build? And so on. Then they have to design some kind of a prototype. The way we did that with the 60 lessons was I've done that now with many, many different groups of teachers. I'll get a group of teachers, organize them by tables, by grade. They study the 5 lessons, and then I say, okay, now you write a 6th lesson. And they're in communication across groups so that there is coherence across the grades. And once the teachers do that once, they get it. Now they can develop the 7th lesson and so on. And there are now schools who've been doing this for some time. And over time, the first initial lessons vanish. And that's not important. What's important is that the teachers now have appropriated this methodology, right? Well, then obviously a lot of this is communication, then figuring out who's going to do what when, identifying what resources are needed, developing some kind of dashboard to keep track of what's happening. Again, communicate, 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 build these processes of PD, execute, and then evaluate, and then do it better the next year and the year after that. And I think the main virtue of a process like that is that it enables networks of schools to talk to each other because they're all using the same language. Well, the last thing I'll say before we open it up for conversation is I tried to put all these, what I had learned from doing this work together in this short little book, which is an open access book. And one of the things that I realized is that in order to doing these things at some scale, meaning outside just one classroom for one teacher, it's very important to develop ways of seeing and of communicating with others who might have different mental models of how school systems change. And so one of the things this book does is to offer 5 mental models on the process of change, which I submit are useful for anyone interested in leading to see the world through those 5 different mental models, right? And one is a cultural mental model. The other one is a psychological perspective. The other one is a professional, an institutional, and a political perspective. And so what's a cultural mental model? One that sees schools as cultural institutions that coexist with other cultural institutions, right? Families, religious institutions, communities, political institutions, workplaces, and so on. And all these institutions are in constant bumping against each other and communicating. And so introducing a world course requires good communication and good alignment with those institutions. It's not possible for the school to kind of roll over all these other institutions or ignore them. I mean, it's possible to try to do it, but it isn't going to last very long. So that's one chapter in the book. The other one is a psychological perspective that says, for example, what Maria Ojala did when she taught about climate change, providing students an opportunity to actually do something is not rocket science. It's just based on good understanding of how efficacy develops and how you can scaffold processes that build confidence that you can do something about the problem. Obviously, many of these curricula which had been evaluated showing that it didn't build self-efficacy had not been built with an understanding of the science of teaching and learning. So that's another perspective. A third perspective is a professional perspective, basically the notion that if you want teachers to do complex things, you have to build the norms and the supports and the roles and the structures that support professional behavior. You can't just assume those things. Education is a profession, and a profession is defined by the fact that it's guided by expert knowledge. But expert knowledge needs to be reflected in the roles that you have. So, for example, what did the Avenue School, the first thing that the school did is it appointed one teacher as the person who owned the world course and who served as a coordinator of this process with all these other teachers. That's an example of that. Obviously, devoting a certain number of hours is building a structure that makes it possible to have this integrated curriculum. Fourth perspective is an institutional perspective. Most system leaders see schools that way. It's basically a collection of institutions and processes that need to be in alignment with each other, right? Your standards have to be in alignment with your PD, with your instructional resources, with your assessment mechanisms, with the way in which the school is led. And then lastly, a political perspective, right? The education system convenes so many different interests that it's essential to try to at least have a conversation so that there is the necessary support to stay the course with change. And so those are the ideas that I wanted to share. Think of them as provocations, if you want, for us to have a conversation.
Thank you, Professor Remus. What a wonderful talk, and it's really a nice gateway to any discussion. And I will start with there's one comment in the chat from, let me see if I can find it, from John Sansone. And his comment is, given the retrograde know-nothingism of both the federal and state governments in the US right now, who is willing and able to use these materials? And John, if I did not capture all of your comment, please feel free to unmute and add to that.
Not just in the US, but of course, the notion that there is value in commitments to global to share problems is a contested notion in many countries around the world at the moment. There are this spirit that animated the creation of organizations like the United Nations as an avenue to peace in the world is very much being challenged nowadays by a set of alternative ideas about how it is that nations ought to engage in the world. And those challenges translate in the possibility of doing the kinds of things I'm describing. I mean, you will be familiar with the fact that at Harvard last year, our own ability to enroll international students was, for a brief period, in question, in challenge. That's an expression of those alternative sets of beliefs. And of course, that makes it difficult to teach about the United Nations or peace or the Sustainable Development Goals or even climate change. And so, but schools have always been not only institutions that reproduce society as it is, but spaces that allow students to imagine a society that is better than the one that they experience. And I do think that all schools have a degree of autonomy without becoming partisan. I don't think anything that I'm saying should be construed as partisan or political in any way. It is cosmopolitan and it does embrace a set of liberal ideas, which are, I think, the product of the philosophical movement called the Enlightenment. So, in that respect, yes, they are ideas of the Enlightenment, I would say. But they're not necessarily affiliated with one or another political party in terms of US politics or politics in Turkey or politics in Brazil. So I think it is possible for schools to still cultivate reason, even at a time when there would be forces in society that diminish reason. I think it is possible for schools and for universities to teach students to think about complex causation, to teach them to have respect for the facts, to teach them to think about different scenarios, to teach them to have some respect for evidence. I think it's possible to do that, even though not everybody around the schools is doing that. But yeah, these are challenging times in schools in America as they are in other places. I think in part because our police has become so hyperactive, and some have chosen PTAs as spaces of contestation. And so I suppose that in democracy, the only way out of these things is more and deeper dialogue. There is no other way but more conversation and more education so that people understand. I will share something with you. The challenges to global education are old in this country. They're not from yesterday or from this administration, anything like that. And with one independent school that I will not mention, a very, very fine independent school in Massachusetts that I've been working, the trustees decided some years ago, about 7 years ago, that they actually, once they saw the world course, that they wanted to have something like that. And they realized that it was going to take some effort for them to put something credible along those lines. So they began a process of preparing their teachers. And I used to teach a seminar at Harvard called a think tank in global education that brought together educators who spent a week basically on those topics. And so that school for 3 years sent people, and the then head of the school told me, I want to send you some of the people who are more resistant to that idea. And one of them was the chairman of the science department, was someone with a background in chemistry. And so he came to the training program. And that particular year, I had the participants in this program go through the process that I described in the 60 lessons, had them break out in small groups, study these 5 lessons, develop a 6th lesson. And at the end of that session, that gentleman came to me and said, I want to thank you because I realized I have been fighting these because I thought it was going to limit my ability to teach science, which I think is so important. And I now realize that there's nothing further from the truth. This is just another way to actually make science very interesting and to give space for what I do. And so I think sometimes we fight over very high level concepts when if we move a little closer to the real world, as in the real world of developing a lesson, we might find a lot of convergence in the lesson. It might be easier to recognize our common interest in something as specific as a lesson than in the high level words that we use to describe what we do.
Thank you. We have a few more comments. One from Adrian Porras, who says, I can see how these lessons would resonate with exceptional students. Do you think your framework is still accessible for average or below average students?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I certainly think that an education that prepares students to understand the world in which they live should be accessible to all students. As I mentioned in the example, what I see at the moment, and I've talked to students in public schools and in private schools, I see that it's easier for private schools to adopt a curriculum like this one than it is for public schools. Now, public schools is a very big category. They are different in Massachusetts than they are in Arizona. They are different in the suburbs than they are in the city. But they do have more constraints, not just financial, bargaining constraints with the unions, all kinds of constraints. The PTAs are very often a big constraint for our public schools. So I think the reality is that that change is harder in the public schools, I find. But I mean, as it is, when you look, for example, one component of a global education, which is providing students the opportunity to travel abroad, even if for a brief period, or to teachers, that happens a lot more often in independent schools than in public schools. And so I don't think we should accept that with complacency. I think that those divisions are should concern us. And but I think that the students are totally capable. My view is that if you can teach students something well, any student can learn anything. And by the way, on that topic, let me share with you in the 2 years that we spent developing the curriculum, we met about once a month with the people who ended up leading all the departments in the Avenue schools. They had already been in place, even though they had been hired before the teachers were hired. And I remember in one of the discussions, we had the curriculum in the 2nd grade introduce the topic of poverty. And one of the heads of that department, a very, very well-prepared educator who was a leader in one of the best schools in our country, said, what makes you think you can teach 2nd graders about poverty? And I asked her, what makes you think you can't? And she says, well, it just isn't done. I said, why? They're going to be depressed. I said, well, how do you know that? Have you ever done it? And says, well, the parents are going to object. And I said, how do you know? So this question that very often we based our curriculum on hypotheses that we haven't tested exists in all kinds of schools, including some of our fanciest schools.
Interesting. We have a question from Molly. I'm curious if other networks of schools have embraced the Global Citizen Framework and curriculum. Has the Partner Schools Network at Facing History, for example?
So to my knowledge, for full disclosure, I serve on the board of directors of Facing History. and I have not tried um, because of obvious conflict of interest to engage them with this thing. Having said that, Mark Siversky, whom you may know, and the previous CEO, was very interested in this curriculum, and I think I mean, they know about it, they study it, and so on. So I guess the short answer to your question is no, but yes, there are networks of schools that have used this curriculum, not implemented it as I designed it. That was not my idea. Used it to inspire their own work. For example, I've talked to many in the International Baccalaureate Organization, and I know they have developed things aligned with the SDGs and developed their own version of those things. But I've shared with them what we have learned in doing that. And and there are various networks of schools around the world that have done similar things.
Thank you. Uh, a question from Stuart. Do course materials exist, or does each school department or I lost my question. Each school department or state organization, education organization have to roll their own?
So in the world course, the one that had 350 units, the unit was not a lesson plan. We did not develop lesson plans because our premise was that very well educated teachers who had the time to develop lessons would prefer to develop their own lessons. And so we did not develop these at a level of specific lessons, but there were resources, suggested activities, links to existing sites, and so on. In the 60 lessons, what we found is that many teachers actually love having a lesson ready to be taught. And so both of those resources, the three resources, do include teaching materials, teaching and learning materials. What I probably will do at some point, I just finished the book, was just literally published a few days ago on artificial intelligence and education, which is a topic I have been studying. And I now see how easy it would be to deploy some AI to take the same materials and to turn them into tools that could converse with teachers in helping them develop their materials, but in providing them more effective support than what one can get from a book. But I remember early on when the world course in the first couple of years got like 20,000 copies out, and I think one colleague told me, says, "Well, you've only discovered how much teachers value materials that have low cost," and I guess that's true. I mean, we by design decided to make this thing um, freely available. So.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. And Alice has a question. How can the educations of students in traditional academic streams be linked to those focused on technical skills to ensure that all have knowledge of both types of skills without valuing one type of learning over another?
So I guess you're not talking about the world course, but you're talking about academic college preparatory curriculum versus what we call technical and vocational. Is that what you mean by your
And,
question?
and Alice, feel free to unmute and
No, because I believe that people need both sets of skills, that you can't have.
No, I hear you. Yeah, but I was just trying to understand the context of your question. It's not specifically
I
about the
worked in
world
a
course.
school where there was a very interesting integration of people. There was a British model system that I was working in, so there was definitely an academic stream and a vocational stream. Um, we spent a lot of time at trying to get students to value the type of learning that they were less exposed to. And I think it's really important at a societal level that that kind of understanding be built into the curriculum so people understand what it feels like to weed when it's 100 degrees in the shade. They need to know how difficult some of the academic issues are, that book learning isn't just for people who stay inside. I think
Yeah.
that it's a societal question that I think is actually a pretty important one.
Yeah, I agree. And I tie your observation to a distinction that we make when we think about knowledge that I think sometimes we forget when we design a curriculum, academic curriculum. And it's a distinction between conceptual knowledge, understanding things, and procedural knowledge, being able to act and use that knowledge to solve problems. And I think very often academic curriculum assumes that if you promote conceptual understanding, procedural understanding will follow. And we know that that's not always the case, or it's not the case for all learners. That's the reason many law firms say law schools do a terrible job because the immediate graduates don't know how to work in a law firm. And that's why many schools say schools of education don't do a good job because beginning teachers haven't been prepared with the procedural knowledge. So I think it is very important. That's why we relied on, I think that there are forms of pedagogy that are more likely to help students develop procedural knowledge than others, and then the conceptual knowledge can follow. Project-based learning being one of them, giving students opportunities to solve real problems, to engage in projects, to learn from doing. I think if I were to describe the two, with the example of learning to ride a bike, conceptual knowledge is kind of learning how to ride a bike in theory, maybe knowing the physics involved, and procedural knowledge is being able to get on a bike and ride the bike. And very often we think that if we teach the physics of riding a bike or we teach that in theory, people will know how to ride a bike. But of course, that's not true for many learners. So I do think that it is useful to have active learning, learning based on problems that students have to solve. I do know, having served on the Massachusetts Board of Higher Ed for a decade, that not in terms of global understanding as I'm describing it, but more generally in terms of 21st century skills, which is a larger category, that some of our technical schools are doing a much better job than our traditional college preparatory schools in developing some of these transferable skills that organizations like the OECD are talking about. And and the one activity that is most promising in that respect in general schools are internships. When students, high school students, have an internship in a place, they develop a lot of these transferable skills that they don't develop in their classes. Um, but anyway, what I have not done with the world course is systematically looked at. I mean, in principle, I think that the ideas I'm presenting here are not designed for one particular stream or another. They are designed for all streams. But what I haven't done myself is to look at what would a global curriculum look like in a school with an emphasis in technical education and how might that be similar or different than a curriculum in a college preparatory school. I haven't done that analysis myself.
Thank you. And we have a question from Lawrence. Could a school help students who can't travel gain some of the benefits of travel by having them study a particular culture or country intensively over time?
Yeah, I do think that there are good examples of organizations trying to do that. On the advisory board of something called the Global Cities Network. And the Global Cities Network is a creation of Marjorie Teven in the Bloomberg's philanthropy to try to do exactly what you're describing, to work with private schools and provide students an opportunity to participate in online project-based learning with peers in different countries. And the idea is to help them develop some of these competencies that I was talking about, the 180 that guided our curriculum, without the need for travel. I think that given the power of technology, those kinds of opportunities are increasingly accessible, and that we could be using them. We should, of course, be evaluating whether the benefits that students draw are how are they similar or different to the benefits from more experiential learning. But even if they're not, even if they're not the same as spending a semester or a year elsewhere, the reality is that we can't offer that opportunity to most students anyway. So yeah, I do think that I mean, I will now mention to one thing that I'm doing at Harvard. Um, we recently designed at the Graduate School of Education an online master's degree. And for those of you who know the institution, know that we have not readily embraced online education except for the extension school. And in general, I think it was just not seen as the kind of things that we do at Harvard. But last year, I mean, there were two things that I think helped us change our mind as an institution. One was the pandemic, where um, over the spring break, every student was sent home, and we had to finish the semester as best we could online. And it wasn't really best in class online education, but it was good enough for people to graduate. And then we had the question of what are we going to do the next year? And the corporation gave the authority to every dean to decide whether they wanted to teach online or not, fully online. And so they had this provisional permission to do that, because as you know, in order to receive a Harvard degree, you need to have spent a period of residency on the Harvard campus. But that one year, 2020-21, that requirement was lifted. And so in the School of Education, we offered all of our degrees online. And we discovered that we could attract some pretty interesting people to our campus, to some extent more interesting than the people who normally come to the residential program. And we discovered that they actually learned quite a bit and that they work hard. So that stayed with us. That happened just a few years ago. And then our interest was precipitated last year when it wasn't clear that students admitted by Harvard from other countries were going to receive a visa to come to the US. And so it was in that context that I talked to my dean and said, why don't we create an online program? And we did. 73 students from 33 different countries. And I've been very curious because I have taught and directed a master's program that brings a similarly internationally diverse group of students. And I have a sense of what they learn as a result of meeting in the classroom from one another. But I can see that a lot of that learning can also happen online when you bring students and they collaborate in projects and they're all in different countries. I mean, increasingly people have a lot of facility to use these online, mind you, these are mid-career professionals with 16 years of experience. They're not elementary school students. But I think even the elementary school students today or the high school students have a lot more facility using technology than I did at their age. So
Thank you. And I will note that Adrian put a link to that initiative, the Global Cities Initiative, in the chat. And in the interest of time, we have one final question. And just a note that I did put Professor Reimers' 4 books that are related to his talk tonight, as well as other books in the chat, if anybody's interested in that. So the final question is from Connie. How does the curriculum work for new immigrant students from other cultures?
So I haven't evaluated it. I don't know. I couldn't answer the question. But I imagine that I mean, I haven't evaluated the question, but I have talked to superintendents in places that have high immigrant populations, that have adopted versions of the curriculum. And what I remember from them, I'm just thinking about this now, is that they would say there is a fairly inclusive quality of this curriculum where membership is defined by being member of the human race as opposed to having a particular passport or nationality. A curriculum of this sort, if you look, for example, at the World Course, it is structured so that 20 different cities around the world in different geographies, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and so on, feature in the curriculum. And so that authorizes, legitimizes a conversation about being from different places, about an asset-based conversation, about international difference. But I haven't, and I know that the director of global studies in the Boston Public Schools, who has come to many of our programs, has used versions of that curriculum, and that's a system that has a lot of immigrant students as well. So I haven't evaluated the question that you asked, so I don't have evidence to answer, but I have reason to think that this is a curriculum that would cause students, provided that they have obviously the academic skills to engage with the curriculum, that would help many children from different parts of the world to see themselves in this curriculum more so than in other curriculum.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your attendance this evening, and especially to Professor Reimers for your time this evening and joining us and presenting a very thoughtful and thought-provoking, interesting talk and discussion as well. We will make this recording available. That will probably be sent out by Ken and the Harvard Club of New Hampshire. And I want to thank Ken for setting this all up. And again, Professor Reimers, for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I have just placed a link on the chat to an article that the Harvard Magazine published, in which I try to make the case for why Harvard benefits from having international students.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank
good
you all
evening,
very
everyone.
much. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.